Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. Now, this is a different episode for me. It is a solo episode, obviously, but I also am going to do something I don't normally do. If you listen to the podcast, you'll note that I don't actually have any advertisements anywhere. I might do a shout out, a call out to do like a rate or review. Sometimes I've mentioned my website, which is www.nolasimon.com. But really, I've never really done an ad anywhere like a traditional podcast. And part of that is because I don't really love them as a listener when I'm listening to other podcasts. I ignore them anyway. I don't actually have sponsors. I don't actually have anybody footing the bill for my podcast. It's just me. And the reason that I started podcasting was strategic. Podcasting really was a way that I could be heard. And it gave me an outlet where I could actually talk and string together sentences in a way that made sense. And I wanted to be able to communicate because you have to think that I spent 20 years on the phone every day, all the time, talking to people. And when my job got restructured in 2020, I went from having an outlet to talk to people about things that were interesting and complicated to not having that at all. And so podcasting was a way that I could really pursue things that I was interested in for my business and educate myself, but then also have an outlet to talk about it in a way that I thought could be helpful to other people. Yes, the podcast is actually set up so that it is at its heart meant to actually promote my business, which is Nola Simon Advisory. I'm a hybrid remote futurist, a B2B consultant working with organizations who actually want to do hybrid remote distributed work in a way that sets the business up to succeed, but also helps their people to thrive. I really come to this from the employee experience. My experience was all embedded in operations, and a lot of the changes that I designed from a position where I actually wasn't in charge. And so it was all related to influence and how I could actually get things to change when I didn't have decision-making power. And that's actually good for a consultant to consider because yes, you're hired by the client. Yes, you have to work with the executives who are in charge and you're making wholesale changes that impact the organization. But as a consultant, you're an outsider. You don't have complete power. And you really have to work with the employer to get changes done. So having somebody who's used to actually coming from a position where you don't have final say is actually helpful. And so that's where I thought the podcast could actually be useful because I could talk about all the different aspects of the work. Because consulting like that at an organizational design development level is far reaching. It involves everything. It's leadership, it's strategy, it's process and procedure, it's communication, it's storytelling, it's day-to-day management, it's technology, it's negotiation, it's emotions, it's complex and it hits every layer of the organization that there is. And that's where the podcast I thought could be really useful to demonstrate my expertise and ability to adapt to all of the different topics that really need to come through in my work. So I've had professors, I've had people who were head of culture, I've had leadership consultants, I've had leadership experts, I've had business consultants, I've had storytellers, HR experts, the variety of people that I've had as guests on my podcast really helps me demonstrate that I can work with all different levels and engage in research into many different areas that's necessary to serve my work as a consultant. And so this episode is really a call out to really explain how I do the podcast, why I do the podcast, and really I can use this as an advertisement for the show notes that I can really embed in the show notes. And that way, if anybody is actually looking for information on my business, it can be there. So that said, that's a long intro to say basically this is an ad. And if you want to tune out, you totally can. I'd understand because I don't love ads. I really don't. And I understand why people bring in sponsors. I get it because it feels sometimes like you're talking to air and it feels sometimes that nobody's paying attention. And there's a lot of times no return on investment. But at the same time, I want it to feel good and I want it to feel good for the guests. And I've been a guest where there were like 5 different ads that interrupted the conversation in the final product. And it really just felt like I was a walking advertisement for the host. And I didn't love the way that felt when I listened to the playback. So I like being a guest on podcasts, and I get that there's a business reason that you're doing this behind it, but I don't necessarily want it to feel like that in your face. And so that's where I thought this standalone episode could be useful because I could then add it in. If you want to hire me, you can hire me for consulting. You can hire me for speaking. And you could hire me, you could actually subscribe to my newsletter on Substack, which has a small fee. I am making all of that free for 6 months. Those are the things that you can pay me for. All of the other work that I do on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Threads, on YouTube, everything else is free. So there's never a shortage of access, but I'd really appreciate it if you happen to know an organization who is looking for somebody for that consulting work, who does need a speaker to speak to what I speak to on the podcast, if you could refer me, if you could introduce me. All of that stuff is gold. And that helps me fund the podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk soon.